Yes, ma'am.
All right. Today is
Thank you, Sherry. Sorry.
That's okay. Today is Monday, May 24th, 2021. The time is 5:10, and we have a quorum present and in attendance, and I would like to call to order this meeting of the Central Health Board of Managers. The first item of business is public communication. Members of the public who wish to make comments during the public communication portion of the meeting must have registered with Central Health via the online form or by telephone no later than 3:30 p.m. today. Yvonne, did anyone register to make comments?
No, Madam Chair, no one did.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. Appreciate you. We will now turn to the regular agenda. Item 1, receive training from Dr. Martha Ramos Duffer. I accidentally put an L in there, on leading in a diverse and inclusive culture to achieve equity in challenging and changing times. I'd like to introduce Dr. Martha Ramos Duffer, who will be leading our meeting this evening. Dr. Ramos Duffer is a licensed clinical psychologist, motivational speaker, trainer, executive coach, and organizational consultant who has spent the past 20 years working with local, regional, and national leaders and organizations. And it is an honor and privilege to have you with us this evening. And Dr. Ramos, I am turning the agenda over to you now. You're on mute, Dr. Ramos.
Wow, classic.
Or I should say Dr.
move.
Duffer, Dr. Ramos Duffer. How do you use Ramos Duffer or Dr. Duffer?
And I use both, Dr. Ramos Duffer,
Okay,
but
so,
in this setting, let's all use Martha.
okay, and Sherry,
so much.
please. So
Okay.
I will turn it over to you, Martha. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sherry. I am
Everyone could mute if you're not speaking at the time. Thank you.
I am very moved to be able to spend this time with all of you this evening. It was so helpful to meet with each of you prior and deepen my understanding of the work that you're doing and get to know each of you. And I feel like I know a little piece of your heart and what brings you to this work. And I'm very excited for us to be able to thought partner this evening with some strategies and ways that we can continue to increase. Okay, so for right now, hopefully you don't see all the 5 million things open. Okay, here we go. And there are several ways that we're going to be using the chat as we move through. So ideally, if you're able to see the PowerPoint and the chat, as well as our faces, that will, I think, enhance your experience of this training. So we are going to be thought partnering together this evening on leadership to achieve equity, acknowledging that we are in the midst of changing and challenging times. And of course, we want to ground this in your vision, mission, and values. And so I want to take a moment to ask each of you to really breathe into imagining this vision. So Central Texas is a model healthy community. Take a minute and slow down as if you were hearing that phrase for the very first time and think about what that means for you. What do you see? What do you envision with that? One of the things that I see is a community where we would not be able to predict health outcomes based on race, based on socioeconomic status. Imagine that world. And the way you'll do this is through this mission, by caring for those who need it most. One of the things that I know about each of you now is that you have a deep commitment to equity and a very sophisticated understanding of the way sociocultural forces, oppressions impinge on people to create inequitable health outcomes. And so you'll have a very deep understanding of what it means to care for those who need it most. And the way y'all do this work is committing to these values of stewardship, innovation, respect, and collaboration. So we're going to go through some sets of knowledge and skills that can help, I think, locate each of you in this work. And I've summarized the objectives for our time together, as you see on the screen in front of you. So first of all, we want to expand the shared understanding of oppressions to better equip you to reach these shared aims. And the key word here is shared. As I already said, you each have very well-developed, advanced, sophisticated understandings of oppression, but we all are coming from very different backgrounds, experiences, areas of expertise. And as we expand the Venn diagram of where that's shared, the better equipped you will be to be able to work together. Working together also requires leadership skills, and all of you on this board are well-seasoned leaders, and I have been, again, so moved and impressed by all of the previous work that you have done and the work you are currently doing to make the world a better place in a myriad of ways. And so acknowledging the leadership expertise that you're already walking with, we also know that as leaders, we can all consistently be deepening and sharpening our skills in strategic communication, organizational ethics, and emotional intelligence to increase our capacity to collaborate and create generative meetings. And here's this word, generative. We're going to spend some time on it in just a few moments, but you're going to hear me say that word a lot. So just for the first flavor of it, start to think about what it conjures for you. But I will start us off with thinking about productive and creative meetings. When we're talking about generative meetings, we're talking about meetings that are both productive and creative. And we want to weave those two objectives together to ultimately reach your mission, to create your vision, which will be done by increasing your understanding, increasing all of our understandings of anti-racist leadership to develop perspectives and skills that support the generation, there's that word again, of meaningful anti-racist solutions that transform outcomes. And when I'm talking about anti-racist solutions that transform outcomes, I'm talking about this envisioned world where we cannot predict health outcomes by race or other demographic factors. So, to engage this work together, I want to invite us to some agreements. And you may like some of these agreements and you may want to keep them going as you move forward in future meetings. But certainly for this training that we're having this evening and the second one, I want to invite us to these, and I will check and make sure that these work for you. So the first invitation is to show up with full presence so that you are authentically engaging with your whole being as a leader, as a person, as a part of this community, so that we can benefit from your perspectives and what you have to offer, as well as you fully benefiting from learning from that stance of full presence. When we start to talk about all the things that we're going to talk about this evening, including leadership and race and how we each show up, we often experience discomfort because we're experiencing invitations to move differently, to perceive the world differently, and that can lead to some discomfort. And so if you feel some discomfort, my invitation to you is to welcome it and sit with it. Sometimes when we feel discomfort, it's hard to stay there. And so we get really impulsive and we immediately want to speak and explain. And I'm going to ask you to not do that. If you feel uncomfortable, It means you're learning something new or you're considering something in a new way. Just be with that and move into the second invitation, which is to start with introspection. I deeply believe that this work begins with internal work, and particularly this part one of our training. I know it's your part two of your board retreat, but part one of the training with me, I'm going to be sharing a lot of frames and perspectives and things for you to consider. We will engage on the chat, and I'm going to ask you to do some thought exercises. And so most of the work today is going to be internal, and we will have more opportunities for discussion and thinking about application in the second part. And so let's begin with internal work. Start with reflection and curiosity. And in the moments where there are opportunities to talk and share your perspectives, I want to invite you to start by making space. We're going to talk a lot about collaboration and benefiting from everyone's contributions. So start by making space, particularly if you're someone that often speaks or often speaks first. Try on what it feels like to step back for a moment and make sure that you're making space. In addition to that, the only way we can benefit from everybody's contributions is if everybody takes space. So please take space when we start to talk so that we can benefit from your contributions, particularly if you tend to be a person that steps back. Then, as we share together, we want to think about this thing that we talk about a lot when we're talking about equity, and that is the distinction between intent and impact. And I will say that they are both very important. The thing that we often miss is that what we tend to has to be impact, not intent, although acknowledging intent is very important. I'll give you a super rudimentary example. If you're walking past me and you knock me over and I fall and break my arm, I know there's a number of physicians in the room, but let's say we got a bone protruding here. If you're standing above me going, oh my goodness, it wasn't my intention, that's not particularly helpful. Could we please see about this bone? What are we going to do? And so what matters in that moment is the impact. However, if you did it on purpose or you did it by accident, that's going to create a really different sequelae to that action. So it's not that the intent isn't important. It is, and it matters. And later I'm going to be asking you to consider intent on this group. But what we tend to when there has been impact is the impact. And then I really want to invite you to remember who you are. Everybody in this room is a brilliant leader who has contributed to the community in meaningful ways. And in addition to that, even if you had not produced anything in your life, you have inherent worth and value. So your worth, your goodness, your value, your brilliance is not in question in this space, nor is it ever in question. The more you move from that place, the less you have to prove. And the less you have to prove, the more liberated space you have to be curious, to learn new things. So I invite you to really stand in that and remember who you are, because we know who you are. You've got nothing to prove. And then an invitation to inquiry before judgment. Back to what I was saying, that I am going to ask you to think about who each other is and your intention. One thing that I can confidently now say that I know about each of you is that your intention is to achieve equity, particularly in the health sphere in Central Texas. So we can afford to start with kindness and compassion, and to start with inquiry before judgment. And then if you're going to speak, ground in your own experience. Not that you're representing other people who share your identities, but use I statements and contextualize your contributions. So for me, I might say, as a Latina woman, I have experienced blah, 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 blah. As a Latina woman, I've noticed that. We want to contextualize what we have to offer. So let me stop there. In the chat, we're going to use the chat in a number of ways to be efficient with the time that we have. So in the chat, reflect in some kind of way a brief phrase about how those agreements are landing with you, if you have any concerns about any of them, or if you feel that they're helpful to create the space that we need tonight and in future moments to work together. So just start dropping phrases reflecting that in the chat. And I'm not seeing anything yet. Can everybody find the chat? Oh, there we go. Sorry, I had the top part of the chat covered with your beautiful faces. Here we go. Okay, great. I'm seeing a lot of acknowledgement of the agreements is helpful. And I know if you're on the phone, you may not be able to see the chat or listening. And I know these will be recorded for us later, but I'll name some of them. In a world of self-depreciation, it's useful remembering who we are, helpful in grounding discussions, important to remember who we are, that we all bring worthiness, helpful and engaging, helpful and appropriate, love equilibrium between making and taking space. Great. Okay. So let's hold that for our frame. And then I'm going to give you two more overarching frames right now. Throughout this time together, I'm going to give you lots of frames. But for this first one, so the first one is going to be about race, and the second one is about being generative. And we'll carry that through the work that we're going to do this evening. So for this first one, how many of you have done the Beyond Diversity training with Glenn Singleton? Okay, I see a hand. I see hands. Not since I can't see everybody, will you also drop into the chat yes and no? Just a quick yes or no if you have or haven't. I think we may end up with 50-50, which is great. Okay, I just wanted to get a sense. So that's super helpful. So if you've done the training with Glenn, this is a Glenn Singleton exercise, and you already know where he goes with it. So if you haven't, but it's a useful thought exercise either way. So I don't want you to put the percentage in the chat. I want you to write it down on some piece of paper that you have next to you, and we're not going to ask you the percentage later. This is just for you. So I want you to think about, when you think about your own life, what percentage would you say is impacted by race? And go ahead and write a number down. I'll give you about 30 seconds to reflect on that and get your number down next to you. Now, let me tell you what I know. If you have been to Glenn Singleton's training, even though he will tell you there is no right answer, I bet you wrote down 100%. And if you have not been to Glenn Singleton's training, you probably have numbers that range from 0% to 100%. I will tell you that the first time I went to his training, I thought about this and I thought, well, I thought about ways that I had been the recipient of oppression. So there was a moment where I was literally denied housing for being Latina. I thought of other moments of actual slurs and epithets coming my way. And I thought, okay, there's significant ways that I'm impacted by race. But then I also thought of all kinds of privilege that I'm walking with. And I thought, oh, but there are ways where I'm not. And so I put kind of a mid-range number. And I got caught in the trap that we often get caught in thinking about the impact of race as negative and not thinking about whiteness or proximity to whiteness as racialized. And so what I came to understand, even in a deeper way, as we start to think about why do our answers differ so much, it's because we have been taught to think about race as one aspect of our lives and as a negative aspect of our lives, and not recognize it as a rich space of both positive and negative impact, because there's all kinds of positive impact of being Latina in my life. But also to think that there are things that are not impacted by race. And that, of course, is not the case. One of the things that we will be going into much later in this training is what we've done with race in this country and what we need to understand about that to be able to lead for equity. And so one of the things I want to start with right now is laying the groundwork for the understanding, and I think this is true across the world, but it's true in different ways across the world. So for simplicity, we're going to focus on the United States. With what we have done with race in the United States, every human interaction is racialized. So even in moments tonight that I'm talking about aspects of leadership or leadership skills or emotional intelligence or other pieces or self-care as leaders, all of that is racialized, and we'll be making those connections. So just let that sit as one of the frames you're considering. And then here's the other frame, overarching for the entire training, that I want you to think about. And it's this word generative. We're going to use it in a number of ways. So when you hear this word generative, what comes to mind? Start dropping things into the chat. Words, phrases, what does it evoke? Love it. Yes. Moving forward, creating new, building upon, creation, productivity, to generate, creating, construction. Yes, yes, yes. Okay. Feel free to drop anything else in, but that's exactly it. When I looked up synonyms to see what other people were thinking of, and the words and phrases that you are naming are all part of being generative. So it's about creating something together, often something novel. And so we want to think about, we're going to talk about this word in a number of ways: how to be generative leaders and engage in generative leadership, how to have generative meetings, how to have generative conflict. And so this is what we want to be evoking when we are talking about that. So when we start to think about generative leadership, we're talking about an approach to leadership that is transformational. For those of you who have studied, we've gone through transactional and transformational, and that's moving out of the great man theory where we started. So here we are. I'm not even going to go into that history of leadership styles and models. We're just going to talk about where we are now in transformational models, and generative leadership is an approach to transformational models of leadership, where we are acknowledging that what is necessary in leadership is active participation. It is not a laissez-faire kind of thing. It is an active engagement, and it is constructional. We are building, we are designing, we are creating something together. And the key there is together. So no room for great man theories here, no room for heroes. What we are talking about is highly engaged in mutuality. What becomes possible when we create processes that truly benefit from all of our experiences and contributions. So it is interdependent, and it has shared accountability. And I'm going to propose to you that I think this is the type of leadership that y'all need to be sharing on the board as leaders. And in this approach, it's acknowledging and harnessing the strength in emergent processes. There's one of those words again. So let that start to evoke. What does that mean, an emergent process? And interactions to facilitate innovation. Because if we're going to create a world of equity, which has never existed, at least in recent history, if we're going to create a model healthy community, we need innovation, and we need something that has not been done before. And so we do need emergent processes. What is emergence? So if anybody wants to nerd out with me later, Google the science of emergence, because that is a really lovely rabbit hole. But I'll give you just a few super brief, and these are very similar definitions. But basically, we're talking about collective, in other words, numerous phenomena or behaviors coming together in complex adaptive systems. So the system isn't simple, it's complex, and it's adapting, it's changing, adapting to its environment. And this phenomena or these behaviors are not present in their individual parts. Complex collective behaviors that arise from simple small elements, the way complex systems and patterns arise out of a multiplicity of relatively simple interactions. So why am I taking us down this path? Because I think that is what y'all are creating on the board and need to create. Emergent processes. In other words, phenomena, understandings, decisions, ideas that would not be present if each of you were thinking independently. So it's a different type of approach to leadership and way of working. We're not saying, here's your brilliance, here's your brilliance, here's your brilliance, here's your brilliance, and we're gonna all put it together. We are saying that when y'all engage in a collective, collaborative, generative process, something emerges that could not have emerged without that. And that's going to be what is required to create the level of innovation that is needed, the level of generation, creativity for the work that stands before you to really transform Central Texas into a healthy model community. So here are some of the elements that when you start to research this, there are a number of approaches. Several people have already claimed the websites, generativeleadership.com, but there are a number of people approaching it in different ways. And what we're talking about is, as you would expect, it's an attitude of care and inclusion. Of course, we're going to be open to experience. We want to be transformed by the process. We're going to be appreciative of differences. We're going to engage in creative and productive tendencies. We're going to have a broad scope of concern. It's just not my piece over here. We're going to be other focused. we are going to acknowledge that we're coming with expertise. So we're going to be generous mentors to each other, motivated to share knowledge, but in a way that encourages others to lead in their own style and voice. And we're going to be emphasizing interpersonal values because of what becomes possible when we work together in these ways. So another way to think about it, we often talk about leadership as fostering a sense of possibility for the future and a commitment to take action on behalf of that future. So we're going to put this together and say, okay, in the generative leadership that you're engaging on the board of managers, you're going to be fostering a sense of possibility for the future. There are many people that believe that racism has always been here and we're never going to be able to change it or its impact. And I don't think that's true. And I hope that you don't believe that that's true, because we need to create a different world where everyone can flourish. And so the sense of possibility is each of you believing that this model healthy community where we can't predict outcomes by race, where everyone who needs care most is receiving it. So you are fostering that sense of possibility. You are grounded and standing in that possibility. And from that possibility, you're committing to action on behalf of that future. But given what we just said about what's required of that action, that has to be in a relational, in other words, way that's honoring relationship, collaborative way that synergizes, I swear the last of these words, what becomes possible with everyone's contributions. Okay, what is the synergizing thing? So we're combining or coordinating the activity of two or more agents, be they people or substances, to produce a joint effect greater than the sum of their separate effects. This is why we have boards. This is why we come together. So let me pause there and drop into the chat. As I say all of that, what's coming to mind for you? What is all of this evoking? And if a few of you want to say a few things out loud, that works too. We'll just take a few minutes on this, but I'd love to hear how this is resonating and sitting with you. Hear and see, whichever you prefer. Drop in the chat or speak up.
Makes me want to get started.
Yay! Nice, I love it. Hope and excitement, desire to hear what others have to say. Feels like the engine is revving up. Who else? Energy to create a connection between members. Yes. A wonderful opportunity to collaborate, to improve our community and evolve. Yes. And you know I love that word, evolve. Okay. Feel free to keep dropping anything in. Thank you so much. And I'm going to take like 1 minute on change management, because I know y'all have all been, and some of you probably teach change management. And I know you've been in many trainings on change management. So I'm not going to dwell here long. I just want to evoke the notion of change management to remind you that one of the things that you are engaging in is change management. You are leading a change process in the community. And so there are some things that we know. Of course, you have to embed it throughout the organization. It only works when a large number of people are collectively aligned and engaging. And it has to be directly tied to a sense of purpose and mission. And part of why I bring out these particular elements of change management is because I think this is precisely what we're talking about, cultivating and growing and deepening on the board, because of course you have to start it within your circle, within your microcosm of work, to then expand it throughout the system. We often talk about this pattern, right? We create the climate for change, then we enable it and sustain it, from creating urgency, powerful coalitions, and then this beautiful model that never quite works this way or in this order. But if we get like super simple, what do we need to do to lead successful change? We got to start by changing ourselves. If we're leading a change, there are probably ways that we have been operating that fits old models or old realities that we have to shift to be able to show up and collectively lead the change that we are trying to create. Back to what I said before, in the current climate, there is no room to go it alone. You cannot lead change, particularly in complex systems, by yourself. So we got to figure out how to work together generatively. And then from those places, of course, we attend to the signs and environment and manage the change. So what we know about equity efforts, and I will acknowledge, we know that equity efforts can be successful, but not successful. Sometimes people will invite me to come work with their organization, and they're like, and they'll say, Martha, can you please give us examples of organizations that you have previously worked with that have already achieved this and that have been successful? Well, it depends what you mean by that. If you mean that have made significant changes, have changed their organizational culture, and are on a growth anti-racist journey, I can show you that all day. If you mean organizations that have fully achieved becoming, having arrived at being fully anti-racist, and you cannot predict any outcome within their organization by race, I don't think that has been done yet. Best as I can tell. But some things that we know is that when equity efforts are well-resourced, sustained over time, integrated into every level, involving reflective processes, including clear measurable goals and structures, are top priorities led and modeled by senior leadership, and are leading to transformational changes in institutional racial climate, we can meaningfully move forward on the journey. So then we got to think about, where do we get stuck? So I want to invite us to think about possibly a new phrase to you, generative conflict. When we put together brilliant leaders with different backgrounds, different experiences, of course there's going to be conflict in the sense of different ideas. But generative conflict is conflict that deepens relationship and trust, because by engaging a dialogue with each other, we're able to mutually expand our knowledge and our understanding of each other and each other's experiences and perspectives. And through that process, we're clarifying and committing to shared values and goals. So it's actually moving us in the direction of what we want. It helps us more fully be and express ourselves, and it better positions us to achieve our aims. So obviously, that's what we want. I want you to take a minute just with that little flavor of it, and I want you to do some visioning with me. So I want you to imagine, I want you to visualize the Central Health Board of Managers working well together to improve the health of our community by caring for those that need it most. I'm sure you all recognize that as your mission statement. So imagine yourselves working well together to do this. So start dropping into the chat. Paint the picture with words, phrases. What do you see? What elements are present? How are you working together? How are decisions being made? How are you treating each other? How are you communicating? Everybody drop that in and just popcorn it out. Of course, you can drop multiple things in. And you can read other people's and then get ideas from theirs and add more things. Keep it coming, really flesh that picture out. I know it can seem obvious, but what we know is there's something that is very powerful psychologically when we share a vision and when we name it. I love it. So this vision, y'all are being collaborative and creative. You're creating together with respect. You've cultivated an environment of oneness in mission and hope amongst all the board members. There's a synergy of actions and ideas to create a better health system. Yes. Trust and innovation. Those are such key words. Elements that are present: earth, water, air, fire, an invitation to go deeper. I love that. Collaborative thinking, working together and not against each other. Envision of similar actions and ideas based on trust. Trust. Okay, everybody hold that vision. That is powerful. And research tells us that we are more likely to achieve our aims when we envision it together. So let's look at what's missing, what gets in the way, and what are elements that we can learn to make sure we are creating that. So one distinction that I find useful is thinking about the difference between debate versus dialogue. Many of us have learned to move in models of debate to where we're proving our point and we are fighting to get our point across. So there are many ways that dominant culture has taught us to make ourselves right and other people wrong. And again, this idea that somebody has to lose for somebody else to win. And the best way that I advocate for myself or what I care about is to make myself right and you wrong. The problem with that is that that creates adversarial frames, and adversarial frames are not generative. They get us stuck and they miss the richness of overlap of shared aims and goals. So in debate, there's this notion, this creation, this construction, as if the sides are opposed. And what I can tell you right now is anytime that comes up in your work together as a board, it is an illusion, because what I know is that y'all all want the same thing. In a debate, you get lost in this, I'm trying to win, and then we're trying to refute each other, find flaws, critique. And then we can further entrench and separate and disrupt relationship and connection. In dialogue, of course, we're working together. We're trying to develop common understanding. We want common ground, better solutions. So we know we're not fighting each other. We know that we are mining, excavating the richness of the difference of our experiences and knowledge sets to be able to create this thing that we want together. So I'm not trying to prove you wrong. I am working collaboratively with you to discover our shared interests and values and the wisdom in what you're sharing. So I'm also going to be re-examining and transforming my own beliefs as they expand from learning from yours. Dr. Mark Hicks put this in terms of multicultural communication competencies. So if I'm able to engage in cross-cultural communication, I'm able to listen and move without imposing my own values and assumptions. I can engage in self-reflection. I'm aware that I have biases and I'm moving beyond them. I'm communicating without being argumentative and competitive. Back to, I know who I am and I know who you are. So I'm not trying to put you down or make me right or you wrong. I'm trying to create an environment where we're learning from each other. So we can reach shared outcomes without manipulating or wearing each other down. And I can be really curious about you and seek solutions that work across all of our interests. So as we think about generative conflict versus destructive conflict, of course, destructive conflict is hurting or harming relationships, is acting as if I don't need you and you're in my way and I can create something better by putting my singular opinion or perspective forward, and it can stop the work. It can just be destructive to the resources, the time that we have to make our shared aims happen. I think an additional frame that can be helpful as we think about this is to think about task conflict versus relationship conflict. So task conflict, we have to make this decision, and I think we need more information to make the decision, and you think it's urgent for us to make the decision with what we know now. We've got a task conflict. So, okay, that's complicated, but as long as we keep it to the task, we can learn from each other and find a way to benefit from the richness both our perspectives have to offer. When we get confused and turn it into a relationship conflict, which most of us have been taught to do, now you seem like my adversary. Now you seem like my enemy. Now I feel like you're putting me down, and that's a lot messier. It's not that easy to come up with a solution there. So when we come up on places of disagreement, it's useful to think about, okay, what is the task? What are we trying to accomplish together? Now, what's going on in our relationship? And how can I care for that relationship? And what do I need to be aware of? Like maybe it's 10 o'clock and we're both exhausted. Or what are the other environmental pressures that may be contributing to a tug towards destructive conflict as opposed to generative conflict? And as we think about the relationship, one of the things that we know is that y'all also have complex histories with each other. And the minute you have people working together for extended periods of time, you will have moments where people have gotten hurt. So of course, on this board, there are moments where people haven't felt valued or appreciated, where they haven't felt heard, where they have felt hurt. And then the question becomes, what do we do with that? Is there something that we need to do to clean that up so that we can move forward and work together? What do we need to do to have a generative relationship? On this board, I'll tell you, it would be lovely if y'all all love each other and think y'all are the best thing since sliced bread. But even if you don't, what you have to have is a generative relationship with each other. You are accountable to the community. Your value of stewardship says you are accountable to the community to do generative work on this board. So what do you need to do to tend to relationship, to protect relationship, so that you can engage generative processes together? You just need the relationship to be generative enough to be able to do that. And so I invite you to reflect, is there any work outside of this space that needs to happen to get to that point? So that then you can think about, how do we separate and have task conflict that we can really apply all of these generative conflict frames to, and be thoughtful about how do we avoid straining the relationship and be aware of environmental pressures that might throw us off. So one more way to think about this, and people are so done with iceberg models, and I know they oversimplify complex constructs and have limited usefulness, but I think this one gives us a nugget that I want to invite us to in a simple, quick way, and that is just the reminder that, of course, most often in a board meeting, when you're discussing something, what you're going to be aware of is the varying positions, the stated opinions, and the strategies that you observe people engaging in to be able to reach their aims. And that can look like conflict. And so then how can being aware of shared values, interests, and needs, everything that we just talked about, the shared aims, and how to really ground and root in that. And it's from that place of thinking about the shared values, interests, and needs that you're going to be able to generate collaborative strategies and solutions. And you're going to have to go there to be able to come back up, because at the top, it's very easy to just get lost in the visible conflict and the illusion that people are against each other, which I now know for a fact is not the case. So one of the many things that y'all are doing on this board is creating a culture on the board. And we can think about culture in all kinds of ways. So we all have the culture of the families that we've come from, the culture of the families that we've created, the cultures in our friend groups, the cultures in our workspaces, and then of course our the culture that comes from our ethnicities and our multiple identities. And so when we think about culture, ultimately we're talking about how do we coordinate meaning that then leads to action. And so one of the things that we're talking about creating is a particular type of culture on this board. And I think that it's useful to remember that there are things that we don't know. So y'all are a group of brilliant people. And I've talked to y'all, and y'all are a really, really smart bunch. And so there's tons of stuff that you know, and that doesn't get you into trouble. And because you're so brilliant, there's stuff that you don't know, and that doesn't get you into trouble either. I don't teach calculus. I know I don't know it. I don't get myself into trouble there. But we all have things that we think we know, but we don't. And then, of course, the entire area of things we don't even know they exist, so we don't even know that we don't know them. And so we have to have a culture of humility. And that is the magic of having people with such different backgrounds and experiences and level of expertise, which is part of why it's so important to not fight for a particular point, because I need to know I might be missing something and I need to learn from somebody else. And because we already know everybody is committed to equity, I don't have to fight for equity on this board. There may be other situations, and I've done a lot of trainings where I had to help people understand that racism is actually a thing that's happening, that has happened and is happening. Thank goodness y'all are not there. We're so far past there. So we don't have to fight at that level. You've got the shared understanding. Now it's just, how do y'all put all this brilliance together to create these shared aims and outcomes. So the next piece I want to talk about is ethical communication. But before we do that, and I should have said this at the beginning, we're going to, because I know I've got a ton of information coming at you, we're going to do 2 5-minute breaks close to each top of the hour that we're together. So here is your first 5-minute break. I've got 6:04, let's call it 6:05, and I'll see you back at 6:10. Please be scrupulous about the 6:10 so we can keep going. I'll see you soon.
Martha?
Yes. Hi, Cynthia.
Hi. I'm sorry. I'm just getting here. I was listening or trying to on the phone since we're on a break.
Okay.
So I'm hoping it's okay for me to speak with you. Do I need to ask David Duncan if it's okay? It's a training. It's not like we're going to vote on anything.
So I need to use this quick break, but if you can message me in the chat.
It's fine too. Or you can talk, you can have a little conversation when we first get back too, either one.
Okay. I just wanted to, because it's been bothering me, and I really wanted to say something about this very quickly. I did not hear what the beginning. I was trying to listen to you as I'm driving my car, and every other word was going out. So it was very, very poor communication. I kept trying to unmute myself so that I could tell someone, well, I have a concern about us using the word race. Because if you talk about race, it's not including the ethnicities or the various cultures that exist. It will talk about African Americans, Asians, indigenous. It'll talk about those things. It doesn't talk about Latinos. It doesn't talk about those that may have Muslims, religions, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'm wondering if there's a word that can be used that will bring to mind and cover everything and all things. Because for the last year,
Cynthia, I think it'd be helpful if everybody heard this. Let's do it when we get back, because everybody's away.
David,
okay.
Thank you, David. Okay, I'll be here.
And
now that I'm back, now that I'm on the phone, I mean on the computer.
And the main thing I'll say, Cynthia, and I'll say it then, is that I want to invite you to try it on, meaning see where the training goes and let me know what you think afterwards, because I think there are some important things about race that we are going to be talking about. So
are we going to talk about language barriers? Are we going to talk about immigration status issues? Because those are as important to me as anything else.
Right.
And I think, and dealing with the population that we serve, those are the key elements of the population that we serve under 200% FPO.
So I think there are a number of key elements.
We're
not going to talk about all of them today. We're going to talk about a few specific things because we have a very limited amount of time. And I do think one of the many important things for us to talk about is race. But yes, let's continue this. Let's continue this when everybody's back. We've got 3 minutes left. Okay, welcome back to everybody. And okay, Cynthia had a question during the break that I want to share with y'all. And again, because there's a lot to cover, we're going to give it a few minutes because I think it's important for y'all to be aware of. And the concern was using the word race, because there is a lot that the word race does not include. It doesn't include ethnic identity. It doesn't include language barriers. It doesn't include socioeconomic status. It doesn't include religion. And that is absolutely true. And so those are all important things that y'all are going to be aware of as you are aware of barriers that people are facing. I also think it is very important to have a shared understanding of the construction of race and how it has been constructed in this country. And so it is important to talk about race. And yes, we absolutely know that when we talk about race, we're not including everything. So I'm going to say thank you to Cynthia for reminding us of that. And I will continue. And part of the request was if I wouldn't use the word race, but because I think it's so important and find a word that was more inclusive to all of these differences and oppressions, but because there is something specific I want to make sure we have a shared understanding about related to race, I will continue to use that word, but certainly integrating the insight and wisdom that Cynthia Valadez is reminding us of, that it is not an all-inclusive term, and there are many other key important oppressions. Especially if we take into consideration the demographic of the population that we were created to serve. If we look at exactly who our patients are, we'll see that many of them fall within the realm of race and ethnicity or religious or whatever. You have to include all of it together if we're going to get to the point of ultimately having to talk about what is going to be an equitable strategy for us to be able to develop practices, policies that we're going to have to develop in order for us to achieve what we hope to be equity for everyone. And that, to me, means that from the top down, we reflect the bottom. Right. And so we're going to be talking about lots of things, and I'm going to keep going. Thank you. Another strand of this is adding to these frames of generative leadership and generative conflict, the strand of ethical communication. So how do I cultivate intentionality when I'm communicating on the board? How am I thoughtful about what do I want to communicate? Because we're talking about, this is a very relational, synergistic process that is contributing to the emergence of particular outcomes that are benefiting from everybody's wisdom. How do I slow down and cultivate intentionality? And first of all, think, what do I want to communicate? What is the purpose of me communicating it? Is the purpose aligned with my values and the board's values? Is this the best time to share it, given my and the board's goals and values? And does this, what I'm about to share, what I'm about to communicate, advance the agreed purpose or aim of this moment in our meeting? In other words, how am I using generative leadership to contribute to the shared aims? So we could distill this into whatever it is I'm about to communicate. Is it generative? In other words, does it contribute to the work we've agreed to do in this moment in a constructive way? So I invite that lens frame. And when we think about ethical communication, you'll often see a similar list like this that includes that the communication needs to be emotionally intelligent, And so I'll add a brief frame about emotional intelligence. I know that a few years back, everybody was reading the book and talking about emotional intelligence. And this is my summary of the entire book in a nutshell. There's basically 4 things we need to attend to. The first category are things we need to know. We need to know ourselves, and we need to be aware of others in the environment. And then there's things we need to do with what we know. So we need to start with so I'm aware of myself. And with that awareness, I'm able to self-regulate to intentionally think about my aims in the environment. And similarly, as I'm aware of others and the environment, I'm able to intentionally use my aims to guide my influence and impact generatively. So this is from EIQ 2. The more I am attending to intrapersonal factors, self-awareness of, and these pieces that we've talked about, knowing who I am, being confident, being aware of myself, and from that, confidence, healthy relationship with myself, and self-awareness, then I'm able to manage myself to be really intentional to create these positive energizers that then contribute to the social awareness. So I'm engaging empathy, social responsibility, this intentional communication that allows me to manage relationships, dyadic relationships, meaning of 2 people, and group relationships for these shared aims. Part of it is being aware of the environment to be known and expanding that to then think about, what are the power dynamics in this situation? One of the things that I've said is every human situation is racialized in the United States because of what we've done with race. And so what are the racial dynamics in the situation? What are the gender dynamics? What are the historically marginalized, targeted human difference dynamics? Of course, I'm not going to know what is going on in the other person's internal worlds, but it's useful to remember that they're there. People have trauma histories, personal situations, mental health challenges. They have dreams, goals, longings. So again, I'm likely not to know what those are, but knowing that they're there can help me be more emotionally intelligent as I interact with this person. And then of course, I'm going to pay attention to external worlds. What is the time available? What is the timing? What's going on? And noise, other physical factors. And how can I use that to increase my intentionality as I am speaking and moving and contributing to a meeting? So all of that self-regulation and self-management requires us to be pretty evolved and in pretty healthy states, because we all know that human beings can be really reactive. So I think that there is an ethical mandate of self-care for all of us who agree to serve, so that we can be in generative states. In other words, there's a particular level of well-being that I need to be able to hold, to be able to be thinking with these levels of intentionality and complexity. So I won't say sneaking in because I think it's really important, but working in a strand of self-care as leaders, because what do we need to do to be able to be in these states? So one thing I want to acknowledge is that we often feel like this. There's a lot coming at us and we're kind of like, ah! And so it's important to be aware. I think this is true for all of you. You're working a lot of hours in whatever field you're in. You're carrying stories of loss and trauma. You're leading and you're making difficult decisions daily, taking care of family, relationships, households, deadlines. Often you have additional volunteer and community responsibilities. You might be on the board of managers of Central Health. And so I tease myself about my age. In the 80s, our memes were these, I don't know if anybody's old enough to remember with me, people would actually copy these in the copy machine. We were less worried about trees then, and then put them around. But just a playful reminder that we are often navigating significant amounts of stress that has a significant impact on our neurophysiology. And so most of us are very aware that human beings evolved to deal with acute stressors very well. I oversimplify this in the crude example of we're walking along savannas with our group. We see some rustling over there in the grasses. And so we immediately scan for what's going wrong, and it's a tiger. So cortisol and all kind of adrenaline, stress chemicals are coursing through my body. And one of two things is going to happen. I'm either going to get away from the tiger and then have this neurochemical response, which turns out is actually really healthy for us, or the tiger is going to eat me, at which point I'll be dead. And the long-term exposure to neurochemical stress response substances is not going to be an issue. But for most of us, we have stresses that look various versions of this. And so what we know is that our brains haven't had enough time to evolve to really know the difference between this and a tiger. And what happens after a long day of stressors and heartbreak and frustrations, you come to a meeting, and it is very easy for your fellow board members to look like tigers and for you to have stress responses. And I often say this is the most depressing slide I have, and it's not a particularly sophisticated slide, but it's just reminding us, oh, stress can have a very terrible effect on your body. But whatever could possibly be going on in our bodies, I think generally it feels like we're unraveling, like we're just not quite ourselves. And the interesting thing that I find useful to know is that we now know that how toxic stress is in our bodies is in part correlated with how toxic we think it is. And that's because we're telling our body how dangerous a situation is, and it's responding accordingly. So in this particular study, University of Wisconsin researchers tracked 30,000, and I don't know what they mean by American adults. Do they mean people living in the United States? So we won't get into all of that complexity of what American means, but we'll just say, I'm going to assume adults living in the United States for 8 years, and people who had a lot of stress had an increased risk of dying. But if they did not have the belief that stress was harmful, that was not the case. You didn't see that same level of increase. So we know that our bodies have some very healthy stress responses. I will confess, not being a physician, all I had heard from the world of psychology was how toxic cortisol was. And I am so excited to hear that it does all kinds of really good things that you want happening in your body. You can see some of them on the screen. So in this other study, they put people in two groups, and in one group, they told people how harmful stress can be to the body. And in the other group, they told people how helpful stress can be to prepare us to respond to something challenging. And you got this level of difference in blood vessels. So I think there are some ways that we can use awareness to help ourselves get good at stress, because clearly, you know, old stress management techniques were like, try to avoid stress, you know, and I know physicians don't do this anymore, but I'm hoping, but we used to all be told, right? Try to avoid stress. It's like, okay, what planet are you living on? That's really not possible, but we can get good at stress. And so we know that there are burnout processes that can start where you're just exhausted bone tired even after you sleep. And that can also coincide with feelings of inefficacy. No matter what I do, it's not going to make a difference, which can also coincide with cynicism. No matter what anybody does, it's not going to make a difference. And that leads to a whole cascade of things that start to happen in how we're interacting. So back to what states do we need to be in as we visualize this vision and this mission and this way of working together and holding hope. Obviously, when we move into these states, it is very difficult to not fall into adversarial traps. This is from the work of Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky, mentioning some trauma exposure responses. And we know we can act like this at meetings. So most of us that are drawn to different types of service work have survived various kinds of trauma. And so it is easy to have that activated in our work, which can also get in our way as we try to remember all these beautiful, complex things that I was talking about. So Judith Herman in Trauma and Recovery reminds us, traumatic events are extraordinary, not because they occur rarely, but rather because they overwhelm the ordinary human adaptations to life. So things that are just overwhelming our internal resources and coping strategies. And we know that that can lead to a shift in our view of ourselves, of others, and the world around us. We know that our brains are constantly creating maps. So again, y'all are very sophisticated people. Your brain doesn't actually look like this, but we are, there are cognitive connections that is helping you know when are you safe and when are you under threat. And what happens when we are navigating stress and we are navigating trauma is that things that are safe can look dangerous. And we know that our brain prefers to have false positives for assessing threat and danger because our brain's only job is to keep us alive, less so to do all of these lofty things. It can do all these lofty things we're talking about if we help it know that we are safe and well. But if not, again, situations can look threatening and colleagues can look like foes. So there are some things we can do to help with that. I would say, and you can tell the world that I work in, because some people would say there are other more exciting scientific discoveries. But for me, it is that new neuronal connections can be grown throughout the lifespan. When I first started teaching human growth and development, sometimes called lifespan development, in 1994, we would teach people that by age 2, all the neuronal connections you had made were all the ones you were going to get for your life. And so good thing we now know that's not true. And how we focus our attention shapes the structure of our brain. So why am I telling you that? There are things that you can do to support your brain in working well with these intentional aims that we're identifying. So I want to share with you the definition of health from Dan Siegel. He started the field of interpersonal neurobiology, and he says health of anything, whether it is a system, a relationship, an organization, a body, a brain, can be defined by integration. So you have linkages, so strong connections, between differentiated parts of a system. That's another way to think about what we're talking about for your work together as a board of managers. Y'all are fully differentiated as leaders with all kinds of brilliance and expertise and lived experience. And then you want solid linkages to be able to produce these innovative responses. So when our brains are integrated and this is going to be super rudimentary. I'm going to say we can think about it vertically. And this slide has an old construct of reptilian complex, which is actually controversial. We can think about it as the brainstem. So we've got neocortex, limbic system, and brainstem, and we want them working together to be able to make sense of what's going on. And we can also think of integration laterally, left and right hemisphere. Now, I know for a while we all went around saying that we were right-brained or left-brained, and if that had actually been true, we would have been in pretty bad shape. So we know that the right and the left hemisphere are always working in concert, but there are things that are initiated in one hemisphere that are then supported by brain activity in the other hemisphere. And so we need strong linkages, so vertically and horizontally. And when our brain is functioning in an integrated way, we are able to be flexible, adaptive, coherent, energizing, and stable. Now think of being in meetings with flexible, adaptive, coherent, energizing, and stable brains. Wouldn't that be great? And if you're ever trying to remember this, Dan Siegel is a wonderful nerd who absolutely loves acronyms. So that actually spells faces, which is why you see that in the little image down there. So everything he does has an acronym. So he uses this metaphor of the river of integration. And when we're not integrated, when we're not well, we can fall onto either of the banks. And we all have a favorite bank. And if you think about the people that you work with or the people that you love, you can easily identify their banks. But remember this introspection thing? I want you to think about your banks. So do you fall to rigidity when you are out of balance? Do you go to this has to be this way, or this is the way we've always done it? And so then it's hard to be innovative and creative. Or do you fall into chaos? It's too much information. We're never going to be able to figure this out. And we all do both. We just have favorites. So how do we get these fabulous, integrated, flexible, adaptive, coherent, energized, and stable brains? So research says that it happens through having strong interconnective neural fibers. I hate to tell you, if you didn't already know, your brain isn't actually this pretty. This is looking down from above, and it's been dyed. And here's some interconnective neural fibers in your brain. And we can both increase those, we can grow them, and increase their functionality through a new R&R, relationships and reflection. So attuned connection with other human beings, and attuned connection with ourselves. So if we want to lead, part of the ethical mandate is to be thoughtful about what do we do to take care of our bodies and minds so that they can show up and be in generative states so we can do this kind of work. I'm going to give you 3 more things to think about in terms of taking care of yourself as a leader to create these generative states. And this is also just basically being healthy as you move in the world. One is reminding us, many of us are familiar with Dr. Brene Brown's work on authenticity and wholeheartedness, and her reminder that every human being wants to know that they are loved, that they are lovable, and that they belong. And we all walk with shame and fear about the possibility that that's not true. And the more we are willing to be vulnerable, and the more we are willing to vulnerably answer that question as a yes, the more we move to connection and empathy, which allows us to get out of performing to be enough and adversarial frames. If y'all haven't read her book, Dare to Lead, I strongly encourage it. And in that book, she summarizes her research where she has narrowed down leadership into 4 skill sets. So the first one starts with vulnerability that we were just talking about. And she likes to really simplify everything. So vulnerability is just the emotion we experience during times of uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. And anytime you are leading, there is uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. Anytime you are authentically engaging in a board of manager meeting, there is uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. So it all is predicated on vulnerability. We start there. And when, as leaders, we move with vulnerability and the authenticity that comes with that, and then we live our values, we cultivate trust, and we reset after failure, the more effective we are as leaders. There will always be failure. There will always be difficult moments. There will always be setbacks. And then the question is, how do we reset? How do we come back from that? There are previous moments on this board that have been very difficult. And part of moving forward generatively is, what do y'all do with that? How do y'all reset from that? There have been moments in relationships that have been very difficult and painful. How do you reset from that to be able to move into this courageous leadership? And in presenting it in these fast overview ways, I do not mean to minimize the complexity that comes with that in any way. I do aim to name the work that needs to happen so that y'all can be as effective as you can be when you work in these ways, and really embrace those values of stewardship and innovation and respect. I forgot one. And collaboration. There they are. And what Brene Brown tells us is that the biggest barrier isn't fear. We all feel fear when we lead in these ways, but the barrier is that our response to that fear is to armor up and to move out of the vulnerability and the authenticity and the full presence. So I invite you, because I don't have a full week retreat with y'all, I can't lead you through all of this, but I invite you to think about, what are the ways that you armor up as a leader, and how can you deepen your ability to stay in vulnerability, to lead with authenticity, and to really live your values and cultivate trust, which is going to be a key piece of moving forward as a board, and then reset after difficult moments. So here's the strategy and summary that I just shared. Dare to lead through vulnerability, know yourself and your strengths, live your values, cultivate trust, and reset. So one more strand. I know a lot of you have been at UT or at UT. Kristen Neff is there doing gorgeous work on self-compassion. And I'm going to lead you through a 2-minute thought exercise. So I want you to think about a recent mistake that you've made. So everybody bring it to mind. And I promise you, we're not going to have to share it with the whole group. Just bring it to mind, a recent mistake that you've made. Does everybody have one in mind? Okay. Notice how quick that is. Whew. Okay. I'm going to say something about that in a minute. Okay. So hold the mistake that you recently made in mind. And now I want you to think about, see if you can conjure, what are the phrases? What was the self-talk? What did you say to yourself after that mistake? And I want you to just hear those phrases for a moment. When you realized you made that mistake, what was your self-talk? What did your brain say to you? Everybody got that? Okay. Now, we're going to scratch that image. We got a brand new image. Now, a beloved friend comes to you and they say, oh, You are not going to believe the mistake that I made. And they tell you the exact mistake that you made, but in this scenario, you didn't make it, they made it. So now I want you to visualize that. They come, they say, oh, you're not going to believe what I did. I did this. And they tell you that mistake. Now I want you to conjure the phrases that come to mind that you would tell your friend. Does everybody have those? Did you notice a difference? For many of us, there are some pretty stark differences. If most of us talk to our friends the way we talk to ourselves, we wouldn't have friends for very long. And this is basically the research of Kristen Neff, looking at the healing and the power of engaging in self-compassion. And the construct is basically what you probably did when you thought about your friend's mistake. So in the moments of vulnerability, in the moments of failure, in the moments of mistakes, in the moments of, rather than armoring up or beating ourselves up, we go to mindfulness. We first notice. With your friend, you probably said something like, oh, that must have felt terrible. You acknowledge what that experience must have been like for them without judging them. And then you probably said something like, oh, that could happen to anybody. Oh, that happens to all of us. You did something in some way to acknowledge common humanity. And then you might have said, okay, so let's figure it out. What do we do next? Either how do we take care of you? How do we engage repair? What's the next step? So you probably actively engaged kindness towards your friend. And so the invitation is to be in that kind of relationship to ourselves. So that's the next strategy. Use self-compassion because it will help you stay in vulnerability and not armor up. And it will help you build healthy relationships. The more compassionate you are of yourself, the more able you are to be compassionate of other people. The more compassionate you are of other people, the more compassionate you are of yourself. So those people that are like, I'm my worst critic. Okay, I get that. But how do we heal from that so that we can look at ourselves and each other in generative ways that lead to generative states that lead to generative leadership? Okay, this is the last strategy I'm going to give you. Boundaries. Sometimes boundaries get a bad rap. And as leaders, we're used to being on 24/7 and we are there for you and we come through for our teams and you can reach me anytime, night or day. And you know, your brain and body will not function that way if you don't have moments of off and you don't have moments of respite and play and joy and connection. So it is very important to know that being an ethical leader and being a good steward is being a good steward of our energy so that we can show up in authentic, full presence. And that requires saying no to what isn't right for you or to things that are not your priorities, so you can say yes to the things that you want to generate and cultivate in your life. So this is your last strategy, not the last forever, but from this little series. It's really important to honor boundaries between different areas of your life so you can live intentionally and with presence. And it's vital that you say no. So you can say yes to what's right for you and what you've intentionally committed to. Because if you're saying yes to everything, you may not be able to prepare for a board meeting or be fully present. So what do you need to say no to so that you can identify what are your biggest priorities? So, oh, look at that. Okay, I recovered some time. I'm so excited. Let's go ahead and take our next break. Oh, actually, I didn't. I just got confused in the order I was doing things. So this is our next big section. So I think it'll help us. So we're going to go ahead and go to 7, then we'll do a 5-minute break, and then we'll do the last piece. And if anybody's getting kind of crispy, let me invite you to stand up, do a couple of jumping jacks, engage whatever movement feels good to your body. You might want to give yourself some deep breaths. Oxygenating can be helpful, because I know I got lots of information coming at you. Hopefully it is feeling useful. Okay, so this next section, we're going to start to apply this and weave together. So ways that we're talking about oppressions and racism are woven into everything that we just talked about, but we're going to start to talk more directly about how we work towards equity. So I want to be thoughtful now. How do we build on generative states, on these generative states that we've been talking about, to lead for equity? So here's this first piece of that. And I want to offer you a particular construction as we think about what is underlying, what do we need to understand about how power has been structured in the United States to be able to lead for equity. So I'm going to start with this really broad question. Who gets to be human? Who gets to have their humanity acknowledged? Who gets to move in public spaces? Who gets to fully participate in public life? Who do we expect to see there? Who do we not expect to see there? Who gets to have the full range of emotions in public spheres? Who do we look at with suspicion if they're inhabiting public space? So, in the simplest way that we can put it, and we all know this, the social world has been structured in a way that distributes power to people based on constructs defining the best way to be human. I'm going to say the construct of race is at the core, but what I know right now is that Manager Valadez and I are defining race differently right now. And so I'm going to say the construct of race and ethnicity is at the core. And so racism, including ethnicity, and we'll talk about that complexity a little bit later, basically is saying it is better, and sometimes we talk about it as ethnocentrism, is basically saying it's better to be white than not be white. Transphobia is saying it's better to be cisgendered than not cisgendered. Sexism, it's better to be male than not be male. Heterosexism, it's better to be straight than not be straight. Ableism, it's better to be able-bodied than not. Islamophobia, it's better to not be Muslim than to be Muslim. Anti-Semitism, it's better to not be Jewish than to be Jewish. Xenophobia, it's better to be from here, whatever here is, than from there, whatever there is. Classism, it's better to be in the sense of having more worth, not that it's better to be middle class or wealthy than to be poor or working class. And so we're going to go into these definitions with more sophistication later in the training, but I just want this initial thinking of how things have been structured in this particular way and see if that is resonating for you. And then I would say that this whole mess of all of these oppressions is based on, we have now mapped the genome. We know that we are 99.9% alike. So all of this mess is based on 0.01% of genetic difference, which isn't even tied to, and I put race in parentheses, you could not identify one gene that every person that is said to be a part of a race or an ethnicity have. So what are we even doing and talking about? I think we're talking about a power structure. And in this power structure, and this is because of the way the United States, and I know there's a lot of controversy right now about history and what we're going to allow ourselves to know about history and not, but because of the way the United States was formed, there is a basis of power structure based on your proximity to Blackness and your proximity to whiteness. I'm going to use myself as an example. So many of you have already picked up, I'm Latina. I was born in Mexico City. I grew up in Puerto Rico. And so I mentioned that there are ways that my distance from whiteness, which in this power structure of the United States, even though I am not Black, puts me in proximity to Blackness in this particular construction. So I mentioned already, there was a moment, I had just gotten my doctorate degree. I had my first fancy job. And so I was going to get my first fancy apartment with my toddler son. And so I called him up, and I speak English. We'll get to that with my proximity to whiteness, but I called him up. At the time, I was just using Dr. Duffer. That's a longer identity story. But so I call up, I'm like, this is Dr. Duffer, da, 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 da. Talk about the apartment. The guy is delighted to show it to me. I'm like, I can head over there right now. I arrive, me and my toddler baby, and he looks at me and he very intentionally says, it's been rented. And I was like, what do you mean? I just talked to you. It didn't get rented in 15 minutes. And he wanted to make sure I got the point and I was put in my place. He said, I said, it's been rented. And I knew that wasn't a fight. I was going to win. And so I just took my baby boy and left. It was very painful and reminded me very powerfully of where I landed. There are many other moments that I could share where the brunt of what I would call racism, you could call it ethnocentrism, came at me, and I was reminded of my place in the power structure. However, there are also many ways that I have proximity to whiteness. So I learned English and Spanish simultaneously. So I speak English in a way that people in the United States would say, I don't have an accent. Now, of course, I have an accent. If I were speaking English in other parts of the world, they would know I have an accent. But that narrative that I don't have an accent gives me positioning and power in the system. It's a privilege and advantage that I can cash in on. I literally make a living from speaking English. So my job is talking. And so, and I could, so some other pieces. So I told you that story. So grew up speaking both languages. My father was obsessed with language. He would pull out Webster's dictionary and we would discuss the meaning of words at the dinner table when I was little. I don't know if you just heard that whole series of Advantage. At the dinner table, we were very poor, but we ate dinner together. And my father was educated enough to have a Webster's dictionary this big. So even though I'm Latina, there's all this poverty, when it came time to take the SATs in Puerto Rico, what do you think happened? Right? So suddenly this proximity to whiteness, I aced them, was a national merit finalist scholar. That led to scholarships. So it created access. So what I want to invite you to do is think about yourself. Because again, I think power has been structured in the United States in this way. If you don't think that, just try it on and see as we go how that feels to you and if this construction is useful. And then there's all kinds of ways that people who are not Black and are not white are positioned in all of these complex intersections in this mix. So what I want to invite you to think about is key, and you probably are already doing this, is we always want to go to a power analysis. And anything that we're solving, so I work across a lot of different sectors. So food insecurity, food justice, violence, health, etc. And across the board, I remember way back in the day, this is going to date me, when Lee Manford was executive director of AIDS Services of Austin, we were in a meeting talking, and he said, Martha, I'm stymied as a leader. We're being to be able to solve the challenges of AIDS, we have to solve the challenges of poverty. And so what we're really talking about, whether we're talking about health or anything else, is poverty. Not to say that race doesn't underline access to resources. And I think it's important to remember that people are not poor because they lack programs and services. They're poor because they lack power in the system. And I think that particular construction helps us think about what we're doing. So yes, if someone is hemorrhaging in front of you, please do something about the hemorrhage. But we are not going to change the conditions that produce the hemorrhaging if we just keep attending to that. We all know this is why we keep talking about systemic change. How do we disrupt systems of power? So I want to invite you to think about, in our systems, in our communities, who has the power for self-determination? Who can access needed resources? Who can safely inhabit public space? Who can live and love freely? Who can access care when needed? And then let's think about this analysis that I'm offering you, which I think many of you already have, but again, to deepen and expand the shared frames that y'all are using as y'all think about this work. So we're at 6:58. We're going to call it 7. Let's take a break till 7:05, and I will see you at 7:05 for our last section. I've got 7:05, so start coming back. Great. Okay. Great, great, great. Okay. So let's keep going. And I know I'm talking about some things that a lot of you are aware of. And I'm hoping it's really useful to create some shared knowledge and some shared points. So one of the many things that I want to acknowledge is that many of us have been taught to not talk about racism in cross-cultural situations and cross-racial situations. And it makes us uncomfortable, some of us. Clearly, I've started to be very comfortable with it and find it very useful to talk about. And I know many of you have also, but it can, talking about racism in the ways we're going to be talking about it today, challenge what we've come to believe. And so I find it useful, regardless of whatever level of expertise you have talking about this, whether you teach about it, train on it, have been to a million trainings on it, to think about where you enter the conversation and what that has to do with your experience of the conversation. So, and these are 3 points on a continuum, but it certainly does not capture the entire continuum. And so there's just some points to help us think about it. So for people who enter these conversations from identities that are being targeted, and in this we'll talk about broader, I'm saying racism, but even broader conversations about oppressions at large. If you're entering the conversation from a position of being targeted, many of us are tired. It's like, we've been talking about this for how long and things haven't changed. And so it can be difficult to have energy and want to engage in generative conversations around this. For those of us who are living with targeted identities, it's hard to believe that it's not intentional. And then when other people say, oh, I had no idea that happened to you, or it was like that for you, or even worse, they say that's not happening to you, you have a chip on your shoulder, that can be really hurtful. And so it can bring up defenses to engage in these kinds of conversations. Many of us enter these conversations from positions of partial privilege, whether it's socioeconomic status or religious status or gender or sexual orientation or gender identity, ethnicity, or race. There are some identities that we hold that are targeted and other identities that we hold that are advantaged in the system. And from those positions, we all have different survival strategies. And so in that, we can have internalized mainstream narratives about the right way to be human. And if you buy that model that I gave you earlier about proximity to whiteness, the proximity to whiteness can be very seductive. And sometimes we see people of color and people who identify other targeted identities really upholding the system, because it can be very, again, seductive. We don't want to be reminded of our own difference, and we want to believe in the myth of meritocracy. What is the myth of meritocracy? Somebody drop it into the chat for us. Exactly. Exclusively the product of hard work. So yes, success is correlated with hard work, but there are people who work very hard and they are not positioned in the system in a way that their hard work yields results. Other people are positioned in ways that it does. And so yes. So All you have to do, it's a completely even playing field, and all you have to do is work hard. And it's the all you as the exclusive piece there. And so think about where you're at with that and what it feels like if you're in that position to think about the system in this way. And then some of us embody identities that have been more advantaged in the system. And when we start to have these conversations, even if we're becoming relatively sophisticated, it can still kind of sting as the guilt comes up, as we struggle with seeing how unjust the world is. And our brains sometimes want to oversimplify and say, but wait a minute, if I buy this construction, what happens to my own pain? What happens to my own struggle? Are you trying to say that my life is easy? And so, of course, absolutely not. One of the things that I know about the human experience is that there is not a version that comes without suffering. You can have all the identity advantages in the world, and I know you've still gone through heartbreak. And most people, there's actually very few people that have success without hard work. Most people have worked very hard for everything that they had. But back to, were you in a position where your hard work yielded results? So one of the things that y'all know about me is that despite growing up very poor, not having any resources, my parents not having any resources, I was able to go to college and get these degrees. How was I able to do that? Back to proximity to whiteness that gave me advantages in the system that positioned me to where my hard work yielded results. There are many Latinas who have worked just as hard as I have and have not had the same results in positioning them in the system. So I invite you to just think about that to the degree that it's useful. Where are you entering this discussion? And what does that help you understand and perceive? And what might it make it difficult to perceive? One of the things that we know is that we learn from our lived experience, which is wonderful. Part of what makes all of you so vital to the board is your lived experience. But we need to be careful that we're putting our lived experience with other people's lived experience to come up with these generative solutions that we're talking about, as well as with our areas of expertise. So it's super simple research. This is an old survey. They asked people, do Latinas, Latinos, Latinx people, they didn't actually say that. They said, do Latinos, but I'm saying it that way, face discrimination. And if you were Latina, Latino, or Latinx, you were more likely to say some or a lot than if you weren't. Why? Obviously, it's what you're aware of. So similarly, this is a Pew Research survey that asked people, are Black people in your community treated less fairly than white people in the community in dealing with the police? And people in this survey, if they were Black, they were much more likely to say yes than if they were white. Dealing with the police and the courts, on the job at work, these are really big statistical spreads. So again, why are people lying? No, it's what are you aware of? And again, what do you have to be aware of? And as a member of the board, there's a lot that you have to be aware of to be able to make the complex decisions that you have to make. So just a moment of time on what we're aware of or not, back to this point of history. What history were you taught in school about these kinds of things? So most of us learned about Rosa Parks as this tired little old lady. Martin Luther King is this very docile leader who just wanted us to get along and have this dream. The story of the Texas Rangers as these heroes that were keeping people safe as if they were not actively lynching Latina, Latino, Latinx people, yes, as well as Black people. Horrific things going on in the history of Texas. If you didn't see the exhibit at the Bob Bullock Museum, it was very powerful. So what stories were you taught? We know that Rosa Parks was a young, vibrant woman engaging in strategy. When we think about our founding fathers who believed in equality, back to the constructions that I've already shared, what do you have to understand to be able to understand how this statement and this reality goes together? So the same person who gave us, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. So we know that women were not anywhere near this equation yet. So first of all, men, but even then, what men was he talking about? Because he enslaved 600 people and actively stated that Black people were racially inferior. So back to who gets to be human, who gets to have their full humanity acknowledged. And then what is the history we weren't taught in school? So if you don't know what any of these things are, and I invite you to jot them down real quick and do a little bit of research later. But they're all heartbreaking, horrific examples of violence, both active violence as well as psychological violence. For example, drapetomania. And if we go into the history of medicine and psychology and racism against people who were not white, it gets really, really ugly. So we've got this background, right? What were we taught? What were we not taught? What does that help us perceive? And what does that get in the way of perceiving? And so then today, many people have this kind of basic understanding, right? So, ooh, racism is bad. So even the most racist of racist people, even like a blatant, explicit white supremacist will tell you, we've seen many examples of it recently in the news, will tell you, I'm not a racist. I just think white people are superior to everyone else. It's like, I don't think you know what that word means. So we have this level of analysis. I'm a good person. Racism is bad. Good people can't be racist. Therefore, I can't be racist. Therefore, people I love can't be racist. And then that gets in the way of what we need to understand so we can change what we need to change that was built on these racist and oppressive foundations. Because if that were true, after 50 years of diversity efforts, and we have had more than 50 years of diversity efforts, for 50 years, across systems, the majority of systems have been having funded efforts aimed at diversity. So if that's the case, why are there still such racial disparities? Clearly, there's a lot more to that, and I've got a lot to say because, of course, I think I know why. And I'm gonna share that with you. So this next series of slides are very rudimentary graphs, and I know that y'all are very brilliant, sophisticated people. Don't get lost in the actual slide. I want to make a point with the collection of the slides. So back to, why are these racial disparities still why are they still present? Let's get curious together. So here's a collection of slides. So if I tell you this is a graph representing the achievement gap as defined, which I will say is a racist phrase in and of itself, because is it really an achievement gap or is it an opportunity gap? What are we measuring? So, but this is what they call it. And so, these are ACT scores. And if I tell you that red line is just benchmark readiness, And the other 4 lines represent 4 major ethnicities in the United States. And I ask you to predict which ethnicities are represented by the bottom 2 lines and which ethnicities are represented by the top 2 lines. What I know is that you know. Even if you're not an expert in education, you know the answer to that. And I want you to stop for a moment and let yourself think about the implication of what does it mean that even if you're not an expert on the ACT, even if you're not an expert in education, you know. What does it mean that we have created that world? And so, of course, what you thought is accurate. If I put the key up here, it's exactly what you thought. So graduation, I was just randomly Googling outcomes based disaggregated by race. This is graduation rates in Minneapolis public schools by race. I've never been to Minneapolis. I don't know anything about the public schools there. But if you tell me that these are graduation rates disaggregated by race, I can know something for sure about the relationship between Black people and white people in this system. Now, for other ethnicities, it is more complex. So, for example, given the demographic makeup of Minneapolis, Native Americans are represented by that green line, and Latino, Latinx people are represented by that purple line, and Black people are represented by the red line. But what is absolutely predictable is this relationship that I'm talking about. So low birth weight by race, ethnicity, and education. This is one that people say, oh, this isn't about race, this is about mother's education. And there is a positive correlation between healthy weight babies and mother's education. But when you disaggregate by race, a Black woman who is a college graduate has worse outcomes than a white woman who has less than high school and GED. So that tells us there's more going on in the system. This is juveniles and residential placement. I don't even need to tell you, you know who's represented by what lines. This is looking at prison population, people shot by police, adult population, looking at Black people, Latinx people, white people, other ethnicities. I'll let you glance, but again, you know what this data looks like. Suspension rates by race, ethnicity. We've all heard of the prison, school to prison pipeline. These are suspension rates for preschoolers. Some of you may have seen this data. I'm just so alarmed by this. When this data came out that I realized that people were suspending preschoolers. I'm like, oh my goodness. We know what to do for an emotionally or behaviorally dysregulated 4-year-old that is much more creative than disrupting their relationship with their teacher, with their peers, and with the education system. Regardless, if we're gonna do something that terrible, it's even more heinous for it to be predicted by race. This gets me to my point. And I'm gonna borrow a metaphor from the Racial Equity Institute. It's called the groundwater metaphor. And this is this idea that if you had a lake and you had a fish floating with toxicity at the top of the lake, you might wonder what's going on with that fish. And then if all the fish were floating to exhibiting toxicity in that lake, you'd have to wonder what was going on in your lake. But then if all of the fish in all the lakes were showing this toxicity and illness, you would have to wonder what's going on in your groundwater. So y'all know our communities are made up of these systems that help us connect and live well. So we have a housing system and an employment system and an education system and a health system where y'all come in. But what we now know is that you can predict most outcomes by race in every single one of these systems. So then we have to stop and think, oh, whoa, wait a minute. There is a way that the systems, there is a way that the groundwater is producing this. And in my construction of racism, this is including all people of color. And so when I say systemic racism, because of this construction of proximity to whiteness and proximity to blackness, anybody who is not white, and we know that even that has changed over time. So when Irish people first got here, they were people of color, considered proximity to blackness. Then, now they're considered white. And so the way the system treats them and responds to them changes. And we will talk later about colorism, but colorism plays a significant strand in all of this. And there's, as Latina, Latino, Latinx people begin to become majorities, one of the things that whiteness is doing is inviting us to identify as white. And I'm like, I'm not going there. So I will acknowledge all the ways I'm advantaged in the system because of my proximity to whiteness, and because of my relative light skin. But until I get the full advantages of whiteness, until I'm not denied housing or I'm not receiving racial epithets and slurs, I will not claim that. I will not claim that identity. But point with all of that, so this seems so obvious, right? If we're saying that the problem is systemic racism, and this is just put in this kind of beautiful way, right? We're going to fix the environment, not the flower. But think about how many of our solutions, and I'm not saying let's not respond to emergencies. There are emergency situations where we don't have time to change the system. We have to respond to the urgent need. So yes, absolutely. But our work has to also be about how do we engage in power analysis and disrupt power and change our systems, or else we're never going to be able to create a world, a healthy community where you cannot predict by race. So, and what I mean by that, for example, the low birth weight scenario. What are the most common solutions to infants considered at risk, or pregnant women who are considered at risk for low birth weight births? What are the most common solutions? I think you're muted, Cynthia.
Education from day one.
Yes. And then Amit, were you going to say something?
Yeah, early childhood development education and
Day one.
behavioral health support.
Yes, yes. So education, we're going to educate you on how to eat, on how to take care of yourself, on how to take care of your child, because we're going to act like the deficit is in you. So we just said it's systemic racism that's producing the outcome, but all of our solutions are acting as if the deficit is in the person. So we got to think about that as leaders.
Martha, I was actually looking at a thing today. I was looking at, I don't know, I was nerding out on social health determinants, something over there. And then, like, you know, the standard social health determinants split that talks about individual behaviors, environment, etc. And then I saw a pie chart. It was like a corresponding pie chart that had to do with, like, literally, it was talking about low birth weight indicators or determinants of low birth weight, and the largest subset of that pie chart was individual behaviors. You're making a great point. This is kind of hitting me. It's very, very, very interesting.
It's kind of, yeah, like a lot of work that was done by Chetney about how much a person's zip code determines, right, their entire life, their zip code, right?
Their quality of life.
Yes, that's what I meant. Thank you. Yes, how much their zip code determines their quality of life. Their zip code, not them, their zip code.
Yes, yes.
Systemic racism.
Yes. And there are all kinds of ways. We're going to talk a little bit more about this system of racism, which another way to talk about it is a system of white supremacy, which is saying it's better to be white than to be in any other race or ethnicity. And so we're going to talk about that more in depth. But basically, what we're saying, there's all kinds of ways that this system sustains itself. And one of the ways that it sustains itself is by the lie that it's all individual choice. And that if we all just made good choices and worked hard, we would all have fabulous outcomes. But we know research has shown us in a million ways that that's not the case. We have a preponderance of lived experience evidence and research-based evidence that that's not the case. And so one of the things that we have to constantly be vigilant of as leaders for equity is ways that these lies slip in. And we have solutions that are based on individual behaviors. And I'm not saying, I mean, we just did a whole section where I'm inviting you to engage in individual behaviors that will help you be healthier. I'm not saying it's not correlated, but when we're talking about systemic racism, you can, first of all, do you have access to the resources to be able to engage in those behaviors? But then second of all, that's not going to cut it. And so can we constantly keep this lens of what are we changing, the individual or the system? In our part 2 of this training, which is your board retreat part 3, we're going to look at a racial justice framework and what are questions that you need to be consistently asking to apply a framework that supports you in making transformational change within systems that transform outcomes. And again, what you will all often hear from people, and I'll get off the slide in a minute. I know after a while it gets annoying because it's moving. What you will often hear from people is that, oh, it's poverty. It really is all about class. And they'll start to tell you, it's not race, it's class. But here's the thing. Okay, sure, horrific wealth inequality in the United States. We all know that. So this is, I think even 2012 data. We know it's a lot worse now, but we've all heard this information that 80% of the population had 7% of the wealth, meaning that 20% of the population had 80% of the wealth. And when you go higher and higher into the 1%, it's even significantly uglier than that. And what we know now is that it's actually worse. It's actually worse than that. But when you scratch the surface of this, what do you get? If you want to predict who's overrepresented in the 20% and who's overrepresented in the 80%, we're talking about a race story. So this is looking at wealth by race and ethnicity from 1963 to 2016 for Black people and Latinx people. So why would this be? I'm not going to spend a ton of time here because y'all know this history, but it's just useful to remember and keep us grounded. Is it individual choices? Is it because people need financial literacy classes? Sure, people need financial literacy classes, but that is not going to solve poverty. So these next series of slides are legislation after legislation that codified advantages for white people. So some of them were done specifically by naming white people, and others were done specifically by providing advantages through a system or a legislation or a group that was primarily white. For example, trade union contracts. So federal housing acts. If anybody wants the actual data from this, I'll share it later, but I mainly just want you to be reminded of the sense of this, because I know y'all know a lot of this history. So FHA, VA loans, how that was working, what happened to communities. And y'all know this 1928 master plan, the history of Austin, and how it was that Black communities and Latino, Latinx communities magically ended up on the east side. I say from close to the corner of Cesar Chavez in Pleasant Valley right now.
My corner. That's my corner.
Oh, we're very close to each other in our rapidly gentrifying neighborhoods. So a lot of legislation that created this reality. And so a couple of other frames that I wanted to remind us of and make sure that we're sharing as we think about how y'all work together as a board and create these generative conversations and processes and this synergy that we're talking about. It's useful for all of us to be reminded, what is the water we swim in? So this idea, the metaphor is probably obvious, but the idea that if you asked a fish to describe water, the fish would say, apparently it's a talking fish, what water? Because all it knows is water, so it wouldn't be able to describe not water. Thank you so much, Sherry, for dropping in that, that resource. That's awesome. For the zip code being a predictor, more so than genetic code. So I want to invite you, okay, other thought exercise. I want to invite you to think about a moment when you were little, you went over to a friend's house and they did something completely differently than they did it in your house. And you're like, huh? Are y'all weird? Are we weird? What's happening? So we first grow up thinking, oh, okay, we do things in this particular way. And the more we're a part of the dominant community, the more we get the message, this is the right way to do things. And people who do things differently are irresponsible or dirty or whatever the case may be. So I want to name a few dominant cultural norms in the United States just to remind us. And again, I know these are knowledge sets that many of you have, but just to remind us for how some of this works. The United States is very future focused. We meet children and what do we ask them? I see Cynthia's mouthing it. What do you want to be when you grow up? Yes. And then if they're middle class, when they're seniors in high school, where do you want to go to college? And then once they're in college, what do you want to do with your degree? And it's somewhere around that point that advisors in college, people that are engaging in interviews, and supervisors evaluating people for promotions start asking the question, what? Where do you, y'all finish it for me. In the chat or out loud, where do you?
I'm sorry, I got distracted. My daughter over here. What was the question? Where do you what?
So people often ask us in jobs, in promotions, advisors, where do you
want to go? I mean, what kind of a life do you want to lead? Do you want to have?
Yes, Julie, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Yes, yes, yes. Like if you're already in college or it's after or you're getting a job, right? Where do you see yourself in 5 years? And this is code, even if you didn't think of that question firsthand, it's code. We all know, okay, where do you see yourself in 5 years? What happens if somebody were to answer, I don't know, just thought I'd hang around and see what unfolds? What do people say about you if you do that? Drop it into the chat. What happens if you do that? I don't know, just thought I'd hang out. What will they say about you?
They'll drop you like a hot potato.
Yes. And they'll say things like, you have no what?
Motivation.
No ambition.
Yes, yes, yes. You have no motivation. You lack focus. Ambition. Thank you. Yes, yes, yes. Amit, I am cracking up with your joke. That's awesome. So yes, you lack ambition. You lack motivation. And think about back to code. In the United States, given the particular version of capitalist structure, you have to have ambition to be seen as worthy. And so then, yeah, so there are many cultures that are present focus, that are past focus. So, and knowing where you see yourself in 5 years is not correlated with making you a better employee, a better leader. There is zero correlation. And yet we're still asking that question, and we expect you to know that code. That is a way that systemic racism turns people unwittingly into gatekeepers that say, if you don't assimilate, if you don't know the code, which not only has the code of the question and the code of the answer, you might be judged pejoratively. And you might be assumed to lack focus, to lack initiative, to lack motivation, which may not be true. It may be someone who is just going to show up in full presence and see what unfolds is actually better for a particular position. So all of these are similar. For time, I'm not going to go through all of them. With punctuality, I can't let it go. I'll say this. It's not that time isn't a useful construct. So when I've given you these 5 minutes breaks and I'm like, please be back right on the minute, it is a useful construct. If Sherry and the other leaders had just said, show up sometime on Zoom Monday night, we're going to talk about some cool stuff. That wouldn't have been very productive, right? It would have been very generative. And so time is a useful construction, but it's very different to say, can we agree to have this particular relationship to time for this particular shared purpose or aim, than to say you're irresponsible, you're unprofessional, etc. Often, you're unprofessional is code for you are not acting white enough. You have not assimilated enough into these ways of being. So then, in dominant culture, some of these things are expectations. For example, assertiveness. Assertiveness is associated with leadership, with intelligence, and verbal modes of expression, use your words. But going back to assertiveness and also thinking about who gets to be fully human. So we expect our leaders to be assertive. What happens when Black and brown women are assertive? What happens when Black and brown men are assertive? So it's not only, you have to be assertive, but then what bodies get to be assertive and have good things assumed about them? Even white women can get a heavy rap for being assertive. So bringing us to this point, why do we have 50 years of diversity initiatives and the same outcomes? Because diversity can be focused on creating access to the dominant culture, which may not accept you or may not be a place where you can fully be yourself, which is required to be healthy. And so diversity may not change anything. We have all seen the situations where people of color are brought into situations and then assumed to be troublemakers, and then either fired or asked to leave. So diversity is important, but it is such a low first bar. If we don't put together undoing structural racism, undoing systemic racism with diversity, if we have racism built into our systems, we're not going to be able to create the transformational change that we're talking about. Back to think about the very relational work. Yes, Cynthia, thank you. Think of the very relational work. There was something dropped into the chat. That's what that reaction was to. So that we were talking about the beginning, when we're talking about the being, learning from each other, sharing our perspectives, taking space and making space and having processes that really benefit from everybody's expertise, everybody's perspectives, everybody's lived experience. We've got to be willing to be moved and changed by each other, not convincing each other to see it our way. Diversity, you can come play at my house. I'm doing structural racism. Let's build a house together that reflects and fits. And I'm going to say all of us, because obviously it's beyond both of us. So one of the things that happens when we have these conversations is that we use words as if we all had shared meanings of those words, and they get us into trouble. So I want to make sure we have shared meanings, and I'm going to offer some possible definitions for some words that are going to guide us through the rest of our work tonight, which is just 15 minutes, and then our next section of work. So race, as we've already talked about, an ever-evolving social, legal, and political construct that has no basis in biological fact. So, as Manager Valadez was pointing out, the current construction of race leaves out Latina, Latino, and Latinx people, as well as some other people in complex ways. And so, but that doesn't mean that we are not racialized as not white and don't still receive a brunt from that. And so it's an ever-evolving social, legal, and political construct that has no basis in biological fact. It's not even a thing. We know that. It's not a meaningful category because there's nothing that predicts who will go, nothing reliable that predicts what will go, who will go in each category. But that being said, then why are we still talking about it? Because of the mess that we've done with it. So if we're going to define race, now we have to define racism. And so if we're going to define racism, I think it's really useful to make a distinction between prejudice. So what is prejudice? We know attitude-based limited information, often a stereotype, usually, but not always negative. We know that a very toxic prejudice against Asian people comes from the myth of the model minority and they're great at math, which not only denies their humanity, and now you don't get to be white, and now you're not Asian enough, and then all of your challenges are obfuscated in that, but also why were Asian people granted this myth of the model minority? Because of proximity to whiteness. Look, these people act in these ways that white people value, and they help us tell our story in this particular way. So anybody can be prejudiced, and regardless of where you fall in the power structure, anybody can be prejudiced against anybody. So women can be prejudiced against men, people of color can be prejudiced against white people, poor people can be prejudiced against wealthy people, right? So then we need a word to talk about the power structure and everything that goes with it that we've been talking about to this point. So we're going to have to add power to our definitions of oppression. Do you have access to resources and decision makers to get what you want done? Can you influence others? When people get confused about a particular identity and where it falls in the power structure, and if it's an oppression or just a human difference, does it make it easier for you to be president or harder? Does it, if you had a child and you were to call your child's principal, how quickly can you get them on the phone? So can you influence? Can you call the mayor? Who gets listened to, right? So can you achieve your aims? And it is putting those two pieces together that we can start to understand oppressions, I think, in a useful way to lead transformative change towards equity. So I don't know if they've changed it yet, but okay, up until maybe a few months ago, and it may still be the case, if you look up racism in Webster's, it will say race-based prejudice. But if you just look at race-based prejudice, that doesn't tell us anything about the power analysis. So let me put it this way. We just said that poor people can be prejudiced against wealthy people. When poor people are prejudiced against wealthy people, what happens to the daily lived realities of wealthy people? I see y'all shaking your head. Nothing. Yep. When wealthy people are prejudiced against poor people and believe that people are poor because they're lazy, because they're doing drugs, what happens to poor people?
Bad things.
Oh, you're still muted, Sherry.
It doesn't show us muted.
Oh, now we hear you. I don't know what happened there. Maybe there was a delay.
Probably. Bad things, you know. And I could give 100 examples, but I'll just leave it at bad things.
Very bad things. Yes. All kinds of legislation, all kinds of barriers to resources.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. Absolutely. So sorry. I wasn't ready to change that yet.
No more unemployment benefits.
Yes. Yes. Because clearly y'all just don't want to work because you prefer to sit at home and not work. So much history that we could unpack on that myth of who's lazy and what we've been taught to think about that. From McGregor's theory X and Y to the history of the Industrial Revolution and the history of enslavement. But so a lot of ideologies that sustain this, but if we're going to understand this, we need to understand that we have to include historical and current power that lead to a system of advantages and disadvantages dependent on your positionality in the power structure is what we're talking about, or else we can't talk about it. And so that's why I think, and I'm about to say something controversial, are you ready? I think that's why it's so important for us to understand with this definition, if we agree that this is useful for the reasons that I've just said, with this definition, can you have reverse racism? Are you saying something, Cynthia? I can't hear you.
I've had this conversation about 50 years now, at least 40 years, and racism is racism. Racism is racism.
So
period.
Okay.
People want to say there's reverse racism. There's no such, to me, it's racism is racism. Okay. It's wrong. When it is used to allow for one group of people or one person or one entity, because they're different, to not have access to the same things or the same opportunities that you have had access to. It's the same thing, you know?
Yes.
I
So-
hear, let's say amongst nuestra gente, okay, the Latino population. You know, I'm from the border, born and raised. So
Okay, say it really quickly
listening to-
because we only have 6 minutes left.
okay, listening to people in my culture sitting there chastising and demeaning los recién llegados, the ones who have just come
Right,
across the border.
Right. Okay.
And
So let me
that's
offer.
still racism. That's still discrimination or prejudice.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you said a really key thing. If it's used to deny access and resources. So I'm going to say that if there is this historical and current power differential, then we're talking about an ism, then we're talking about an oppression. If there is not, and that doesn't mean that prejudice isn't horrific. Prejudice is harmful, is terrible. We need to eradicate it also, but we have to have a way to talk about the difference. And we have to understand this history and how it plays out in our systems so that we can have transformative solutions. If we cannot name a problem and we cannot accurately understand it, we cannot solve it. And so when we pretend that there is not a historical power differential and that term reverse racism is used to say that white people are being disadvantaged in the system. Can a person of color be very cruel and unkind to a white person and cause damage? Absolutely. But in the overall system, in the systems and institutions, given the outcomes that we're talking about, in the aggregate, that is not the case. And I think this is a really important distinction to get. And I think we need to get better at our definitions.
That's
Sometimes we talk about being anti-racist. And if you go to the dictionary for help with that, you'll hear the policy or practice of opposing racism and promoting racial tolerance. And a question I'm inviting us to ask ourselves is, does it disrupt the power structure? Does it disrupt the barriers to access and resources? And if it doesn't help us because it leads to the illusion that racism are these individual acts by individual people. And if it were that, it wouldn't be having the impact that it has. So if we're going to be anti-racist, we're going to have to intentionally and actively perceive, name, disrupt existing power inequities and structures, recognizing these are racially based. And again, language is so complex. When I'm talking about disrupting existing power, I am not talking about anarchy. I am not talking about overthrowing anything. I am talking about creating systems of shared power where everybody can equally benefit from our systems and our institutions, so that each of us who is in this room with some level of unearned advantage in the system is using that to weaken those systems of injustice, so that we're using that to stop racist policies, procedures, and practices. We're going to get into this more next time, but how do we know if they're racist? If they produce outcomes that we can predict by race. So we need to create policies that produce equitable outcomes. We often talk about inclusion now, and that sometimes is just the word of the day for diversity. So you can sit at the table, but we're not changing the table and we're not changing how we do things. So we're not talking about just access. We're talking about full participation, co-creation, and belonging. I'm going to end with this piece about language. Norming whiteness and centralizing whiteness and this particular structure goes so deep that even in the language that we use to talk about this, when we say diversity, diverse from what?
That's right.
You can have a room full of white people and 3 people of color in there, and they'll say, oh, we had all this diversity. What do you mean? You're talking about diverse from white, which is centralizing, norming whiteness. When we talk about equity, we often set what, for example, in the school system, white people is the standard, and can we get people of color up to that standard? When we talk about inclusion, who gets to do the including and who is being included? So I'm not saying we should throw out this language. I think it's useful shared language at this point. I'm just saying we need to deepen our understanding of how power and race and ethnicity and privilege is built into the system. We will go deeper into all of this next time. Please jot down any thoughts that you have about this, any questions that come up for you. I invite you to email me in between, and we can incorporate your thoughts, questions into our next period of time together. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. I know we're at 8 o'clock and I know we have to do a formal adjournment. So I'm going to pass it back to Sherry.
I see a hand raised. I assume this is for you, Martha.
No, Sherry, actually it's for you.
Oh, okay. Yes.
What I'd like to know is, because remember I had a big disadvantage in not hearing anything for a full hour. I'd like to know if we're going to be sent this the link to this meeting so that we can rehear it if we want to, which I do.
It's recorded, yes.
And could we have somebody send us all the link and the PowerPoint presentation,
yes,
please?
Absolutely. This entire meeting has been recorded, so you will be able to watch the entire meeting and everyone will get the slides.
Thank you.
You are very welcome. So thank you, Dr. Ramos, Duffer, Martha.
With Martha.
Martha. I put Martha on the end there. Thank you very much. Thank you for all of those who were with us this evening for our second installment in our 3-part series of board retreat to save us all from endless Zooming, right? So we will have one more, our third installment in session of our board retreat, and Martha will be with us for that. I appreciate the time and attention that everyone on this board is giving to each other and to these important training and topics very much. I know that you're busy and you have all kinds of things in your life, so really, really appreciate it. And to all the staff who are participating and making this happen, we deeply appreciate that. So with that, before we adjourn, I would like to remind everyone that on Wednesday, we will have a special call Board of Managers meeting at 8 a.m. Yes, I said 8 a.m. in the morning. It's on your schedules, I hope. An executive committee meeting at 5 p.m. on that same day on Wednesday, and a Board of Managers meeting directly after the executive committee meeting. However, I will remind everyone that we're giving everybody a break in the month of July. So that's why things are rather front-loaded in June. At this time, I'm ready to accept a motion for adjournment. Do we have one? Manager Valadez?
I move to adjourn.
Second? Manager Bell. Thank you. We have a motion and a second. So we are adjourned. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, members. Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Hi, everybody.